Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're diving into a genuinely fascinating psychological tension found in the ancient texts of the book of Ezra. We're looking at a specific moment where a leader's very public, very bold convictions crashed head-on into real-world danger. This isn't just some dusty story about an ancient migration. It's actually a profound, highly relatable look into the human struggle of matching our daily actions to our words when absolutely everything is on the line.
Okay, let's dive right into this. Ezra, who was a scribe and a leader, makes this remarkably bold declaration to the Persian king. And remember, this king is arguably the single most powerful man in the world at that time. Ezra is basically looking this massive earthly authority dead in the eye and saying, hey, the ultimate power protecting us, it isn't your empire, it's the hand of our God. It is this beautiful, incredibly confident statement of faith. But as we're about to see, making a bold claim in the safety and comfort of a royal court is a whole lot different than living it out in a perilous wilderness.
First up, we're exploring a shift in perspective, moving from a grand historical record straight into a deeply personal testimony. Now, what's really interesting here is a subtle grammatical shift in the source text that literally changes everything about how we experience this journey. The first 6 chapters of the book of Ezra read just like a standard third-person historical chronicle. It's very detached. But suddenly, right around chapter 7 and moving into chapter 8, the text shifts dramatically. It becomes deeply, intensely personal. The author actually starts using I and we. So we're no longer reading a distant historical record. We are reading Ezra's personal, vulnerable diary. We're stepping right into his shoes, seeing the journey through his eyes, and feeling the immense, crushing weight of his leadership.
Moving on to our second point, stopping at the Ahava River and the sheer physical weight of this journey. So, right before they could actually embark, the entire group stopped at the Ahava River. Now, this was not some scenic finish line to celebrate at. It was a starting line filled with immense, palpable anxiety. Just to get a sense of the scale here, according to the genealogical records in the text, there were about 1,500 men initially, plus another 250 Levites and temple workers gathered at this river. That is 1,750 adult men standing there. But wait, that number only counts for the men. When you factor in the women, the children, and likely the elderly who were traveling with their families, historians estimate this was a massive, incredibly vulnerable migration of somewhere between 4,000 to 5,000 people. And they definitely weren't traveling light. The source text tells us they were carrying an enormous amount of treasure: gold, silver, precious vessels for the temple. So picture this in your mind. Thousands of civilians essentially acting as a slow-moving, completely exposed bank vault of unimaginable wealth. And the kicker? They were facing a grueling 4-month journey. That's 4 whole months of walking through unpredictable, brutal wilderness that was absolutely notorious for bandits and ambushes. I mean, if you're leading a group like this, basic survival logic dictates you need to be arming your people to the teeth and preparing for war, right? You weren't just packing extra trail mix for a trip like this.
But here is where the story takes a truly shocking turn. Right in the midst of all this chaotic, frantic preparation, Ezra just halts everything. He doesn't hand out swords. He doesn't start drilling the men for combat. Instead, he calls for a fast. The text says he did this so they could humble themselves before God to ask for a safe journey. He intentionally stops all the practical, physical preparations to focus entirely on spiritual humility. From the outside, it seems completely, utterly counterintuitive to their survival. Which brings us to the third section, aligning life to confession, and the core dilemma at the heart of this story. This right here is the psychological core of the entire explainer. Why in the world didn't Ezra just ask the Persian king for a military escort? The king had already shown him immense favor. A royal decree had literally just been issued. A simple, basic request would have easily secured a heavily armed regiment of soldiers and horsemen to protect these thousands of vulnerable men, women, and kids. Why walk into a dangerous desert totally unprotected when a royal army is just one simple request away? Well, the answer is one of the most powerful aha moments in the entire text. Ezra writes, I was ashamed to ask the king for a band of soldiers and horsemen. Now, why was he ashamed? It wasn't because he was just fiercely independent or blindly brave. He was ashamed because of that really bold confession we looked at earlier. He had just told the king that God's hand protects those who seek him. If Ezra immediately turned around and begged for the king's army, his actions would make his words look like a complete lie. Asking for troops would fundamentally, completely contradict the bold confession he just made.
And this brilliantly illustrates a universal human struggle that we can all relate to, right? Think about how often we declare a deep conviction, say, declaring that God is our ultimate strength on a Sunday. But then, when the rubber meets the road on Monday, our reality looks completely different, and we immediately reach for our worldly safety nets. Usually when there's a gap between our high confession and our harsh reality, human nature steps in and we lower the confession. We say, well, I believe it, but let's be practical. But Ezra, he did the exact opposite. He absolutely refused to lower his confession. He chose to elevate his reality to match his words, even when it literally meant leaving his hands totally empty of physical security.
Let's move into part 4, a quiet answer, 4 months, and trusting the unseen.
Having made this absolutely terrifying decision to step into the unknown without any protection, how did God actually respond? Well, the text gives us this incredibly simple, wonderfully understated verse. So we fasted and implored our God for this, and he listened to our entreaty. That is it. The skies didn't split open, a pillar of fire didn't suddenly appear out of nowhere, there were no angels materializing with drawn swords. There was just a quiet, deep, internal assurance that God had listened.
You know, the source material draws a brilliant contrast here between the spiritual validation we usually want and what we actually get. We often crave loud, dramatic answers, kind of like the infamous 1992 rapture prediction in South Korea, right? Things driven by huge emotional frenzy and instant media gratification. But Ezra's reality was a quiet answer, a silent assurance that would only be proven over a long period of time. He had to walk for 4 months, totally unprotected, through highly dangerous territory, relying entirely on the memory of that one humble prayer back at the river.
So the crucial point is that true validation didn't come at the starting line. It just didn't. Fast forward to Ezra chapter 8, verse 31. The text says that the hand of their God delivered them from the hand of the enemy and from ambushes along the way. But, and this is a massive but, they only knew this for a fact after they arrived safely in Jerusalem 4 entire months later. True faith, as illustrated here, means walking the terrifying, completely unverified path day by day, relying solely on the conviction you started with.
Finally, we reach part 5, our Ahava River, and the question of what you are holding on to today. Now, the history here is absolutely fascinating, but it asks us to pull this ancient dilemma straight into our current lives. Let's move forward and see how this builds upon the rest of biblical theology. Hundreds of years later, the Apostle Paul wrote these famous words, "My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness." This so perfectly echoes Ezra's ancient decision. Ezra realized that emptying his hands of military might wasn't some kind of fatal weakness. Actually, it was the exact space required for a higher power to be made perfect. It was the only way his life could genuinely reflect the true magnitude of his confession. Which leaves us with this final, truly provocative thought to consider. Think about the challenges, the transitions, or maybe even the dangers you are facing right now in your own life. When the pressure really mounts, are you frantically looking around for your own soldiers and horsemen, relying on those worldly safety nets that contradict your deepest beliefs? Or are you willing to pause at your own Ahava River, completely empty your hands, and truly align your real-world actions with your highest confessions? It's a profound challenge to carry with you. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and I genuinely hope this sparks some deep reflection on the paths you're walking today.